Welcome to the September 21, 2022 meeting of the Lake Bluff Joint Plan Commission and Zoning Board of Appeals. Agenda item number 1, call to order and roll call, please.
Certainly, Member Danley.
Here.
Member Fisher.
Here.
Member Miller.
Here.
Member Sorensen.
Here.
Member Toll.
Here.
Member Russell is absent. Chair Peters.
Here.
You have a quorum.
Thank you. Agenda item number 2, non-agenda items and visitors. We allocate 15 minutes during this portion of the meeting to allow anyone from the public to address the commission. Maximum of 3 minutes per presentation. Is anyone in the public that wishes to address us tonight? All right. Hearing none, seeing none. Agenda item number 3, consideration of the August 29, 2022 Village Board and PCZBA Joint Workshop Minutes. Has everybody had a chance to review those?
Mr. Chair, I'll just note that we received some minor typographical corrections from Member Fisher that we would like to recommend you incorporate.
Okay. Yes, those will be incorporated into the record. Any other comments with respect to those minutes? Hearing none, is there a motion to approve?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Motion carries. Agenda item number 4, consideration of the August 29, 2022 PCZBA special meeting minutes. I trust that everybody's had a chance to review those. Any proposed revisions or other changes? Hearing none, is there a motion to approve?
So moved.
Second.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, motion carries. All right. Agenda item number 5 is administering the oath to those participating in the public hearings tonight. If anyone wishes to participate, please stand and raise your right hand and we'll swear you in. Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God? I do. Please be seated. Thank you. All right, agenda item number 6, public hearing text amendment, Central Business District parking. Mr. Cole, could you give us a brief overview, please?
Certainly. So this is inspired by and a reaction in part to the next item on your agenda, which is the special use permit for Hansa Coffee. In short, I would really characterize this as cleaning up the code, making it match our intentions, and just fixing some artifacts of how it's been pieced together over the years. Right now, if you read the code today, if you look at it plainly, when there are changes in use, you may think that you're required to provide additional parking. We know that this body and the village board previously years ago took actions to make sure that's not the case, knowing that we have historic buildings, we have existing buildings. There's really no ability for an individual landowner to provide additional parking. Similarly, when you read the code, the compromise at that time was to say, well, anytime you get a special use permit, anytime you get a variation, you need to provide parking to try and keep some control with this body. You have that ability either way when you're considering these things. If you think parking is an issue, you can make conditions about parking, or you can use that as a basis to deny relief. But when we have this in here, basically it just adds a lot of procedural complexity, and it doesn't really change the questions you're considering. So as staff, we want to recommend that we change these provisions. As you'll see, excuse me, as you'll see, the draft ordinance really makes just very clear, very generous grandfathering provisions, understanding that most of these situations won't be cured. You still have the ability to insert these conditions. The one notable matter is in how we've administered this. Some developments that have come through, but not all, have been required to provide parking at the train station. For example, the Village Commons property, Block 1. Some businesses that have come through, but not all, because their special uses have been required to do the same thing, such as Innovasi, for example, and our other restaurants, as we'll talk about. But there may be switches in tenants in certain buildings where they don't have parking on site, but they're not required to get train station parking. And we know anecdotally and from our enforcement efforts that we still have people parking where they shouldn't downtown. The only real substantive change here is saying that when you get a new certificate of occupancy, when a tenant changes over, it can be any use. We need you to show that you have a place for them to park, whether that's on-site or the train station. You need to find a place for them and show that you're continuing to do it. So, again, a small improvement along the way, really minor changes in general. Happy to answer any questions.
What does off-street mean?
So on-street parking, we, the village, own it, right? I mean, there's a parking space right in front of, let's say, the new Hansa, the old or the new Hansa Coffee establishments, right? Off-space parking, or off-street parking, I should say, is typically, you know, owned and maintained by a developer or by the property owner. So, for example, the parking lot behind Block 1, when you go in through the drive-through for the ATM, that's all privately owned.
Okay.
So what about did Hansa, or the current location, did they have parking in that, behind the building on?
That parking to the north is a village-owned parking lot. It's the Walnut Lot, so we have permits for it. To the east on the street is village-owned. To the south, I defer to Rob Douglas. You know, there is a parking lot to the, you know, the west of that building. I think that's all services Block 1.
Any other discussion, any other questions for Mr. Cole?
I wonder if you could just update us on any ideas the village has about parking improvement and any of the more recent comments. If anything has come in, people are coming back uptown, and what's the latest?
Sure. So as far as this specific item, I spoke with one individual by phone who didn't choose to submit written comment, just explained what was going on. No other comments we've received. In general, you know, the village did retain Rich & Associates, who did the village's old parking study, to update that study. We expect, I believe they're finalizing that work now. We're hoping to bring it to a meeting of the village's Business Advisory Ad Hoc Committee next Wednesday.
Okay.
And so we'll have some more information we'll share with you. Right now, it looks like the conclusions haven't changed a whole lot. When they reviewed this in 2013, they said, you know, there might be places where it's more difficult to park, but it's healthy, and that's it sounds like that's where we're continuing to end up. But I'm probably premature to, you know, I'd rather let that report speak for itself.
Sure. Okay, thank you.
All right. Anyone from the public wishing to address this particular issue? Hearing none, seeing none. Any other questions from the commissioners? Is there a motion?
I'll make the motion to accept the ordinance as written.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay.
To recommend approval.
Yes, recommending body, yes. All right, if we could have a vote, please.
Certainly. Member Fisher,
Aye.
Member Danley,
Aye.
Member Sorensen,
Aye.
Member Miller, Member Toll,
Aye.
Chair Peters. Motion carries.
Thank you. All right, agenda item number 7, public hearing, Eating Place Hansa Coffee at 24 East Scranton. Mr. Cole, if you could give us a brief overview, please.
Certainly, and of course, I'll note the applicant is here and has come ready to present. This is, I think, conceptually a simple application to understand. Hansa is looking to move from the rear tenant space in 600 Walnut building, or I think it's 24 East Scranton building, to the front tenant space. So that was formerly occupied by Wisma and B Market. I think it was a butcher at one time. That's before my time. But they would move to that front space. That rear space would become vacant, could then be used for any, you know, permitted use under the zoning code, or there could be a special use application later. They're very similar sized spaces. They're in essentially the same location. If anything, we think that, you know, having it there up front towards the corner will just make it more attractive for people to use on-street parking around the village green, which tends to be underutilized in the time of morning when Hansa does a lot of its business. So we've given you some history as far as the original approval of Hansa. We've given you a draft approval ordinance that has really the standard conditions that the PCZBA has applied to restaurant uses for the last few years. That's saying you have to park at the train station. You have restricted hours of operation, but those are relatively generous. They are more generous than the business's actual operating hours, and giving some additional flexibility to change those hours or to change their floor plan or things like that by going to the village board without necessarily needing to pay an application fee and seek a public hearing and everything else. Again, trying to keep our code working in a way that's flexible, business friendly. So happy to answer any questions about the memorandum before we invite the applicant forward.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Cole. Mr. Douglas, if you would like to present, please.
My name is Rob Douglas. I'm the managing member for Lake Effect Holdings, and I'm a resident here in Lake Bluff, 673 Maple Avenue. There's really nothing different from what Hansa is currently doing, have been doing for the last 5.5 years, except for the fact that they're going to have a space slightly larger, so their occupancy is a little greater than it is right now based on the code when it comes to public assembly spaces. Otherwise, they're going to be having street presence versus more of a side street presence they have currently right now. So there's really nothing different beyond that. 5.5 years of history has shown that they've been a very compatible business in town and have not had any negative impact on any of the standards that are outlined in the special use permit. And special use is being applied here because of the fact that under, what is it, the SIC code 5812, eating places without drive-throughs or drive-ins. And then under the OSHA description, coffee shops are considered an eating place. So hence, it falls under a restaurant equivalent. So that's why we're here for a special use. I don't think there's really anything I really need to add because history has pretty well showed its record pretty well here with this particular business. So I'm here to answer any questions you might have.
And you've addressed all of the conditions in your submission, so we'll incorporate that by reference.
Yeah, I mean, I can go through and read them if you'd like, but for efficiency, it's all pretty well documented there, so.
All right. Any questions from the commissioners?
One quick question. Is the current operating hours of Hansa, is that 6 a.m.? Is that the current time, or is it?
Well, I have the two partners here of Hansa, but yes, I believe the current location opens at 6 a.m. Hours were modified during the COVID period, but 6 a.m. And what they'd like to be able to do is be consistent to the hours of all of these downtown businesses. I think consistency is a nice thing to have, so I believe, I really haven't dived into the ordinance to know for sure, or a record of other businesses such as Innovasi, Mavry's, the brewery, Prairie, bar, but I believe their hours, correct me if I'm wrong, Glenn, but I believe it's 10 p.m. during the week, and then they take it to a later hour over the weekends, but I'm not up usually that late, so.
Yeah, generally true. We've got a table I'm happy to send you later, but something the PCZBA has talked about separately is trying to make one set of hours. The hours are a little different for each business, and we're trying to, one of the things the group has considered is trying to just make that more standard.
So the hours that are in this packet, I would do an asterisk on it to be consistent to the other businesses in downtown. And I'm sure the owners of Hansa would be okay with that.
Yeah, I think the request would be for a slight expansion on paper anyway, and that seems reasonable.
So the way in the ordinance is currently, what's proposed in here, just so everybody's aware, those shall not be open for business to the public no earlier than 6 a.m. on any day, no later than 11 p.m., Sunday through Thursday, and no later than midnight on Friday and Saturday.
That was my best guess on what I think is going on with the other businesses, but, okay. Any questions at all from partners here, or?
Any other questions from the commissioners?
Just how late do you typically stay open? I know you don't have to go till 11 or midnight, but what's the,
Right now, we're currently open until 6.
and pretty much sticking with that, you think, or?
Because of the flexibility of the space, we'd like to have the flexibility.
Sure, understood.
Stay open until 11 if we have an event or.
Right.
And 6 a.m.'s okay for opening time?
Perfect. I don't want to get up any earlier than that.
Understood.
Just to say it again for the tape, in case you didn't catch it, it was open till 6 now. They want to keep the option to
Right.
stay open later. So I'm just trying to, can't hear anything past right here, so just trying to say that out loud.
All right.
Well, my only comment is, I can't believe it's 5.5 years, to be honest. That's pretty amazing to me, but I think they've been great tenants, you know, and I think it's exciting to have them come to a more front and center kind of location, so I'm in favor.
Any
Rob,
other-
one question, just more out of curiosity. Do you have an occupant for the current Hansa space?
Nothing definitive. Got some very interested parties. One advantage to that space is the fact that there is black iron and makeup air in the ceiling of that space, which accommodates the ability to put a cook line in. And there are businesses that are looking at that as a possibility. So, and the goal would be to have something that would be, help diversify the choices and options in downtown. So, but nothing definitive at this point.
Thank you.
Right. Any further discussion?
Mr. Chair, I just note 2 things. One, of course, we have an online component to these meetings. There's one person participating online and hasn't asked to be recognized. There's no one else here in the audience to join us. I'll also note, because of that last item we just discussed, right now, strictly speaking, Hansa would need a variation as well to move in here. We expect, you know, if both of these items are taking up, you know, if the last item is adopted first, if it's not held up for any reason, Hansa wouldn't need that variation. But just understand that the recommended motion you have includes granting that variation if it's necessary, a variation for the not providing parking on site.
Okay. Barring any further discussion, could we have a vote, please?
I'll make the motion to recommend to the village board to grant the relief. If they do need a variation, then I would also move to recommend that variation for parking.
Thank you, Mr. Dahl. Second? Now it's time for a vote. Mr. Cole?
Yes. Member Danley,
Aye.
Member Sorensen,
Aye.
Member Miller,
Aye.
Member Toll,
Aye.
Member Fisher,
Aye.
Chair Peters.
Aye.
Motion carries. Thank you.
Next steps?
Yeah, so next steps, we'll have this on the village board's agenda for first reading Monday night. And if you can be present, that would be great. This coming Monday, this room, 7 o'clock.
Yeah, I'm here.
Cool.
Thank you. Okay. Agenda item number 8. Public hearing text amendment planned residential developments. Mr. Cole, if you could give everyone a brief overview, please.
Certainly. So the village has had these regulations to this extent, authorizing planned use, or planned residential developments on the books since 1974. Coming up on, it's what, close to 50 years. They've been used to authorize a number of developments in town. We received, the village board directed that staff, the PCZBA, the board, should, in advance of future developments, review these regulations. They are just as old as 1974 would imply. The field of zoning has come a long way in that time, and we've worked with staff, the village attorney, our consultant in this matter, Tesca Associates, represented here by Michael Blue, has worked very diligently over these last months to produce a modern planned residential development tool that'll better enable future development, that'll better communicate the village's expectations, that makes, we think, a more robust process that is built for today's development environment and, your planning goals and managing this process. I hope, projects like Target, projects like the NSWRD pumping station show that when we have, I hope I can say validly, that when we have robust processes to manage these developments, we can get really good outcomes. So with that, I'll just note there have been a total of 5 public workshops on this item. Those packets, those minutes have been included in your presentation, as well as some highlights of key points. Rather than go step by step through the ordinance, we wanted to allow Mike, Mr. Blue, to come forward and present them to you. I know a lot of this is familiar, but we wanted to start from zero, just walk through the final product with fresh eyes and make sure there's a clear understanding and an additional opportunity to ask Mr. Blue or staff any questions.
No. Thank you, Mr. Cole. Mr. Blue?
Thank you all. It's nice to see you again on this side of the room. Glenn gave a great introduction about the purpose here, and we've got a PowerPoint that we can share, and we'll make a record for those that are either watching at home or might want to take a look at this later, just so that they kind of get the same overview of what we're up to. And Glenn, if you go to the first slide, just summarize real quickly the process of what we've been to, and Glenn described it a little bit. There was both a technical and a substantive review of the ordinance. So we looked at it from kind of a technical perspective. What was really useful, though, about this process were those workshops that Glenn mentioned, the 5 joint meetings that we had with the village board. And I'll get into describing the findings a little bit later, but in terms of what the process was, it included a technical review, it included these numerous workshops that we had, which is important for making sure that what the ultimate outcome of the product is what the village is looking for. There were also a number, I should say, of staff workshops where I sat down with staff and Corporation Counsel, and we kind of went through what is this going to do, how's it going to work, is this technically sound, is this legally sound, and really we've kind of looked at it from every angle, and this is the process that you see here that we followed. We're at the adoption stage. So let's go through and we'll talk a little bit more about the substantive parts of it. In terms of that technical review, which is basically me sitting down and reading the code and comparing it to those that other communities have, those that I've worked with, and those that other communities have worked with. There's a few things that jump out, and they're summarized here, and I'll just go through them briefly just to make the record. But the code as it sits now is kind of quantitative. It's got some calculations in it. It's got some figures in it. It lacks a qualitative explanation of what does the village want to see. And when you get to a planned development, a planned residential development, or the other planned developments that the village uses, it's really important to understand not just the measurements and the distances, but the concepts. What do we want to see here? And as I've said a couple of times, that's why we started our workshops with the village board, not talking about zoning, right? We talked about what does Lake Bluff want? What is Lake Bluff? What's unique? What's special? And then we talked about how to put that into the code. Our findings in terms of looking through, there was really no purpose statement that described what the village wanted here. There were land uses that were permitted, but it wasn't really clear why or how, and the list wasn't really complete. I think one of the bigger problems was the process. The process to go through was not clearly spelled out, and it was hard to figure out. When zoning works best, it's predictable. Not in terms of what the outcome is going to be, but in terms of that process is going to be. That's attractive to the development community because they know what they're going to get into. But more importantly, it's attractive and understandable to residents, to you all, to the village board. We all know what comes first and what comes next. And that's really missing in the current part. And that made it difficult for everybody involved to know what was coming. The other thing that was an interesting quirk about it was that much of the formal approval happened in the final stage. Right, so plan developments, as you know, but so everybody knows, there's a preliminary stage and there's a final stage. A lot of the approval process and the findings of this group were backloaded towards the end. So there's a lot going on before the applicant gets to an understanding of whether or not this is even going to be feasible. That's very discouraging to the development community and keeps them from coming to communities that have that kind of process. Slide. Gut reactions, our initial take on it was, I guess, the opposite of the findings, right? Was that there's need for a clear purpose statement. And the purpose statement that's in there and the description that's in there is quite thorough, and again, based on those workshops that we had. There was hint and understanding of the need for maybe dwellings other than non-single unit developments, but it wasn't clear, and that needed to be specified, and I think we've done that. The PRD standard should better address the whole development. And so the standards that were in there, the setbacks and whatnot, they were all for a regular home in a regular subdivision. And again, that's, I think, as much a function of what Glenn described as the age of the ordinance. There was not a lot of opportunity, although it could be applied informally, for informal review, right? We were all sort of dumped into the hearing process at the beginning. It's like, all right, let's go. Which is hard. It requires a lot of background, requires a lot of information, requires a lot of the applicant, and also requires the village to process a lot of information without ever getting to the question, is this really generally what we want to see? And that's one of the changes that's been made. So let's go to the next slide, and we can talk a little bit about the process, and we'll go into this in a little bit later. But I think that, again, as you know, because we've talked about this, but for those that may be watching to understand, the process inherently goes from informal to a little bit more structural, to where there's a technical review and understanding done mostly with staff to make sure that all the information is there. There's an optional community workshop, which is going to the neighbors and saying, here's what's going on. So that's all very informal. Then it gets to be a little bit more technical, a little more process, right? Step D up here about the preliminary plan review. That's a formal process, right? That's the hearing with you and design review and involving architectural review. And that's where you start to get to the brass tacks. What's important is at this point, the village is really answering the question, is this the development that we want? And is the format of the development, the way it's laid out, the way the houses are, the type of development, is it what we want? And essentially saying yes or no, voting to approve or recommend. And your recommendation at that point would go to the board, and the board would have the same discussion. At that point, you've essentially said, yeah, this is okay. And then the very technical work, the hardcore engineering, which is really where a lot of the cost is for the development world, that's where it comes in. And this is a much more traditional, much more familiar, much more efficient, and from the developer standpoint, a much more reasonable approach, which is, you know what, they really like what we're doing. We've negotiated how many units. We've talked about where the streets are going to be and all this stuff. Now we're going to do the hardcore engineering. And that comes back to you. And really the only question at that point that you have to deal with is this still substantially the same development? Right? And when they went down and they got their fine pencils and they went, we need to put the road over here a little bit, or we need a little less open space, is it still basically the same thing? And that's the consideration. What can happen, and what I've seen happen, is the developer will come back with a whole different idea. Well, you know, the market changed a little bit, and now we want to do this kind of housing and that kind of housing, and we're going to add 50 units. That's the trigger that they're going to start over, right, and go back to the beginning, which is fine. And everybody understands that this is a process that takes place throughout communities throughout the area and the country. I want to point to that last step in there about the final approval on the board. This is all ultimately up to the village. This is not a developer-loaded or developer-supportive approach. It's an approach that requires and invites discussion, deliberation, and satisfying the standards that are spelled out in here. And the only way this gets approved is if those standards are met by the applicant. So let's go through and we'll talk a little bit about what's actually in the pieces of the code, and we'll do this quickly, but again, for the record, wanted to share kind of the approach here. It got longer. It got a lot longer. And the reason is very much what I've just been standing here saying is there are a lot more things to contemplate. There are a lot more characteristics of the village to convey. There are actually a lot more things to ask of the applicant. And those are all listed in here. And we'll go through these, but there are a lot of things in here that are, again, as Glenn said, modernize the zoning. There are things that were not part of this process back in the 70s that are now, and that those have been added. So we'll go to the next slide. And just a slide or two on each of the sections that are in here, and I'll talk about those briefly. So first is a purpose statement. All good zoning ordinances start with a purpose statement, and that's part of the idea of, as you look at it, that's the question that you and the community and the village board can be asking. Is this doing what we have in mind? The current code does not really paint a clear picture of what the village is looking for, and the new ordinance does. I think this part is 3 or 4 pages long, right? And as I mentioned too, this was built from those workshops that we had. I always say the hard part about zoning is not writing it, it's figuring out what you want it to be. And again, my kudos to all of you and the village board for your stamina in those meetings and sharing thoughtfully, and that's how we got to that purpose statement. Fun? Applicability in many ways is one of the more important questions that gets asked by a zoning district. It's essentially saying, when can we use this and who gets to use this? When can the village apply this and when can somebody take advantage of this? And throughout the workshops, we probably spent as much time on this as any other topic. And as you'll recall, we narrowed down to say that the PRD has to be used for a residential development of 6 or more acres or of 10 or more dwelling units. 6 or more acres is historic. That's been in the code. It's not a bad number in and of itself because the idea is to require that this happen when you're dealing with a larger development, where there are options, where there are opportunities for different and creative development, where there's potential for a greater impact on the neighbors and the community as a whole. So that's why 6 acres is there, and 10 units is sort of the same reasoning. There are options where a developer can request to use this, and they're listed up here, but again, there are with the intent of the developer meeting the village's goals. Common ownership, this one's kind of technical, but the idea here is that somebody comes before you, they actually control the property, right? So that's the other thing that's important here. This is not somebody with an interesting idea that wants to come and test it out before you. They have to be vested in this process. They have to be either the owner of the property or have a contractual control, typically an option to purchase or some such thing. So this also allows you to deal with the person who's got some control over the property. The new ordinance specifies what types of land uses and what types of residential can be part of a PRD. This does not say that there is carte blanche to do any of these types of residential development or make any of these non-residential developments part of it. It merely says these are the sorts of things that the village will consider. The way these are laid out, the way these are designed, the way these generate traffic, the way these impact the environmental character of the site, all need to be proven up as meeting the standards of the code. This is the quantitative aspect of the code, is this section 5 here, that talks about what is the maximum density, which is based on the underlying zoning of the property. So again, just to take a step back, every one of these properties will have an underlying existing zoning district in the village, and the PRD becomes a way of applying this process and these additional standards to it. So there's a maximum height, there's a requirement for open space. There are rules that say if you're going to cluster the development, you don't have to, but here's some good ways to do it. There's some regulations in there, standards in there about anti-monotony. There are requirements about connectivity, so we're not creating standalone isolated areas. We're creating neighborhoods that connect to other neighborhoods. Some of these are very quantitative. Some of them are a little bit more objective and require the applicant to stand before you and then the village board and say, here's how I've met the connectivity aspect. Here's how I've met the anti-monotony standards. Something that's new in the code that's common in plan developments is the notion of a public benefit. And the idea is a simple and well-tested one in the development process, which is the village is open to taking a flexible and creative look at the development standards that are applied to developments. And as part of that, that's what the village is sort of putting in. What is the applicant or what is the property owner putting in? Well, plan developments generally require there be some form of a public benefit. In some places, public benefit is not defined. In some places, public benefit is narrowly defined. What we did here was we took from those workshops where we talked about what was important about Lake Bluff to you all and to its residents, and we identified those as being the public benefit that a developer could offer to meet this standard. Here's the process. I said before I would describe it quickly and then come back to it. I think I described it in more detail than I had in mind initially. But again, just to reiterate, it starts as an informal process. It gets more formal and requires more as we go along. The one thing that I would add, and frankly, the part of this process that I find the most valuable is step C up here, the pre-application meeting with the PCZBA and the Architectural Board of Review, which is where the applicant stands before you. They have not done the final plans. They have not done the detail engineering. They have come before you with a thoughtful and very explanatory concept of what they're doing. And they will ask all of you, what do you think? I'll show you what they want to do and say, what do you think? And they're looking for your feedback. And there's two things that are good about this meeting. One is it's a chance for you all to say, you know, when you come back to the public hearing, here's what we'd like to know. That's a much more efficient process than having that happen at the public hearing and then everything's got to be continued and dragged out. It's a chance for the public to be at this meeting as well, and for them to maybe say, well, you know, when you do the traffic study, right, so there's a sharing of information, understanding. The other thing that's important about this, and I have seen this happen, is based on the feedback that that comes to the applicant from the village. A lot of times they will go, you know what, they don't like this. I don't want to fight the fight. I'm going to step away. And when we talk to developers, they like this step. They like knowing that they can dip a toe in the water, if you will, and see if what they're thinking about is really where the village's head is at, if you will. And if this is an opportunity for them to walk away, then that's fine. That's why it doesn't necessarily sound like it. It's a very developer-friendly approach that really kind of costs the village nothing in terms of how far down the road you have to get. So that's another added bonus of this new approach and the process spelled out here. As I said before, the part of what the village is doing here is being willing to take a flexible look at its own standards. One of the questions that always comes up is, well, does that mean that everything can be looked at? And are there any limits to what we will consider? And the way the code is set up, there's pretty much broad leverage to consider relief from the underlying zoning regulations. But there are a couple of things as we work through this that we set limits on, and that was height and density, as you see here. The height, 40 feet, which is the highest residential height in the community, and then density being up to 125% of the underlying zoning. And just a word about that, because again, we spent a lot of time on it. You were all very thoughtful about it. So just to let others know who may listen to this, is to know that if somebody really wants more units, right, they have the opportunity of rezoning. And rezoning has its own process and its own set of standards, as you know. But the idea is not to have everything trigger a rezoning or have the zoning kind of always be up for grabs. The idea is to say, look, if we get a development that meets all these standards, that meets the intent of the village, that meets our goals, we will consider, not grant. Again, none of this is carte blanche, right? Even at 125% or 124%, The development that comes before you has got to meet the standards that are spelled out in the code that are reflective of your special use standards and are reflective of those goals and objectives we talked about in all of those meetings. So no matter what says here that is available to be modified, it still needs to meet your standards, it still needs to meet the goals that are spelled out in the code, and it still has to be approved by the village based on those standards.
If I may add something very
Please.
briefly, Mr. Blue. Something I would add is, you may need a rezoning as part of this process, right? That doesn't happen in a vacuum. There's parts of this code that make sure that's coordinated and that you have different sets of standards, but you're considering these things in a cohesive way. One of, I think, the good things about planned developments is they make the decisions of this body more accessible to the public, right? We're not talking about a list of 500 variations that reflects the differences between a multifamily development and a single-family house. We're really talking about the development. We're talking about what the village wants. We're talking about the issues that really matter down the road.
Well said, thank you. And I would just comment too, as we went through this, one of the things that we talked about was, that there aren't a ton of these that you all process, right? And so the application process, this whole process is a little new and a little different. And I would tell you, speaking on behalf of those of us that do this process all the time, we have a lot of faith in the process, because the process is very structured. It's very structured in that it lets the community be involved, lets the resident be involved. As I said, it creates predictability. There are many spots in the process for staff to make sure that technically it's sound. And so the process that's spelled out here really helps do exactly what Glenn was saying. And again, a couple of more technical things here in terms of concurrent review and amendments that are possible. Sometimes it's possible if there is a smaller development and an applicant wants to do that preliminary process, which is the concept, and that final version, which is the engineering, if the project is relatively straightforward, or they have confidence in the approval, or they met with you at the pre-application meeting and feel good about it, they can do those steps together. It doesn't happen a lot, but there are times where it's appropriate, and it's nice to just have this authorization in your code. In terms of amendments, so once you have approved a planned development, or a planned residential development in this case, there are some times where changes come up, either because when you start putting shovels in the ground, sometimes you find things that need to be moved. Sometimes building materials are difficult to find, so sometimes things change. The code specifies what's allowed to change, and almost in percentages, right? Don't lose open space, don't change the type of uses. What are you allowed to change? And it divides it into major and minor changes. If there's a major change, it really does have to go back to the beginning of the process. And I think that's about what we have. So, as Glenn said, this is an opportunity for fresh eyes, and if you'd like to have some further discussion or questions of me and the staff, we're glad to answer those and go through it again. Again, I would just reiterate what I tried to say last time, was that this was really a family affair, right? The fact that you and the village board were so involved in so much of this from the get-go, that so much of the village staff was so involved from the get-go. Right districts have been doing this for a while. It was a real chance to see the goals of the community really be codified, and I hope you'll feel good about that as you get the chance to apply this process.
I wonder, Mr. Blue, I should have asked you this earlier, if you could just state your name for the record and your
I've been here so
position.
many times. My name is Michael Blue. I'm with Tesca Associates. Our business address is 627 Grove in Evanston.
And thank you very much. I thought it was an excellent presentation, excellent summary, and makes a tremendous record for the village and for the citizens of the village. Any questions from the commissioners?
I have just one question. Thinking through this again, would this have changed, or how would this have changed? One recent one that we did comes to mind, 500 Arden Shore, where it was, I think, 8 acres for the property. It became it was a family compound because it was one house and a pool house and a smaller guest house, as I recall. Would that have then come through this process. I think we ended up with variances through single family, if I'm remembering right? So this, it would have had to go through this process then, correct? Because it was 8 acres?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I haven't considered it. I'm reacting a little bit. I considered it, I suppose, at the time.
Right.
So it was of the right acreage to be required to go through this process. In many ways, I mean, that project looked like a planned development process. We used, because it was on a small scale and it was still single family at the end of the day.
Right.
We used the processes we had, but it still had, essentially we approved a preliminary plan, the plat. We said, you need to come back with a final plan. They did. It was a planned development without being one.
Right.
So the process, I think, would have looked very similar. I think that's an example of a project that may very well have used that concurrent preliminary and final plan process.
Right.
Because it is so simple.
Right.
They may have also chosen to spread that out as they did because they wanted to close their sale first and then design later.
Right.
You would have needed deviations. I mean, I'd want to sit down and think about it a little bit, but I don't think you would have come up with anything radically different as far as process or outcome.
Right. No, I mean, that's the only one that came to mind that probably would have gone this direction then, had this been in place at that point, and probably would have ended up with the same result, I would think, that they achieved.
I think so.
Right, okay. Thank you.
Any other questions from the commissioners?
I have a what-if question. In the multifamily section of town, right, just off of the CBD, say 2 of those units that have multiple housing in them are bought up, and somebody wants to build a more modern multifamily dwelling. It's under 6 acres, but it's also 8 apartments rather than 10 dwellings. Does that create a PRD?
Yeah, so I think part of one of the layers here, in addition to the size, is there's a
It said
map.
10, it said 10 up there.
It did? Oh, 10 dwelling units,
10
right.
dwellings, yeah.
So before you even get to that question, there's a mapped limitation here, which is essentially there's certain sites that the comprehensive plan says may be redeveloped in the future. That's the Stonebridge property, some adjacent lots.
Right. I'm saying if in town, if enough property gets bought out and they want to build a bigger unit,
They would not be eligible for this process. So you have to be within the mapped areas and also meet the size requirements.
okay, so how would we handle that? As a zoning
Straight
issue?
zoning.
Strict zoning issue?
That particular one, you might remember, for example, from our 15 East Washington discussion, this is about 4 years ago. Unless you have a foot into the central business district to be able to use our planned mixed-use development tool, unfortunately, right now, there's not a great option for you. And these changes don't change that. We have an R5 zoning district that's ostensibly for multifamily, and we know from experience that it's practically difficult to build effective multifamily product there. I would say if you look at the village's comprehensive plan and wanting housing choices, things like that, if there's a desire to see more of that, that's probably something on the to-do list.
Yeah, so they would proceed under as-of-right zoning. Either they meet our code requirements or they don't. And they could seek variations, which they either would meet the standards for a variation or not, depending on what the proposal would be. So they still may end up in some capacity, depending on what they're doing, possibly before you. But if they met all the requirements of the code, it would not come to this body.
All right, so say it was a 10-unit, would that, even though it's not in 6 acres, but it does 10 dwellings, would that trigger this?
Unless it's in one of those mapped areas.
It has to be in that.
It has to be in the black areas up there on the board, yeah.
I thought it was either or, okay.
I think that this map was intended to assuage fears of just that in some areas of town, you could assemble a few parcels and potentially get to planned development where we weren't foreseeing it.
Would be a whole different avenue to address. Okay.
Thank you, Member Miller. Any other questions or comments from the commissioners for Mr. Blue? Any activity from the internet public?
Sure, so we still have one person tuning in out there on the World Wide Web, the information superhighway, who has not asked to be recognized. I'll note that aside from our esteemed village administrator, Drew Irvin, we have an empty house here at Village Hall.
Not a big concern of the village.
If you like. Is that for a motion? If you want to do that, you can ask for a motion.
As the commissioners are aware, this has been a very, very thorough and lengthy study and evolution. My thought is that in that we're missing one member tonight, that perhaps the preference should be to consider continuing this matter one last time. I don't necessarily think we'll have the presence of Mr. Blue here for that, but it would give the entire body, all 7 members, an opportunity to finally digest and decide this. So if there is a motion to continue, or if there is not,
Did George make any mention that he was opposed to something like this?
I asked Mr. Cole, and there was no comment.
Yeah, we tried to get the materials out early to give everyone extra time to review. Member Russell and I have been in communication about attendance tonight, but he didn't have any comments.
And he's not shy about creating his opinion, is what I'm saying.
I couldn't express my opinion about that, but
Right.
Because
So,
honestly, isn't it, I'm interrupting, but isn't the test really going to be if a developer comes forward with this, or a developer and the committee and all of the village, I think that's going to be put to the test.
Yeah, I don't know why we
And I
would-
think we've done really a good job in putting a packet together with collaborating, and we're going to continue to collaborate when a developer comes forward. So I would propose that we move forward and get this going to hopefully make some positive changes.
I agree. I think we should go, we've talked a lot about this.
I agree.
I believe most of Member Russell's input, if not all of it, has been included in this final document.
Very true.
He has made many comments over the course of this period, and very educated, particularly from his background. And I do appreciate wanting him to be here for the final recommendation, but I do believe that he's very much represented in this final document.
Agreed.
Thank you,
Right.
Mr. Cole. Any further deliberation? Any further discussion? Hearing none, is there a motion? And again, we're a recommending body in this particular matter.
I move to recommend the village board approve the draft text amendment.
Second.
Second.
We could have a vote, please.
certainly. Member Sorensen,
Aye.
Member Miller,
Aye.
Member Danley,
Aye.
Member Fisher,
Aye.
Member Toll,
Aye.
Chair Peters.
Aye.
Motion carries.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Blue.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, good job.
Agenda item number 9, public hearing, comprehensive plan amendment. Mr. Cole, I'll let you provide a brief overview.
Certainly. So this is a less common one. We'll stop sharing that. This is a less common item that this board does, I believe. So we adopted the village's current comprehensive plan in 1997. Since that time, I'm going to check myself here, but I believe it's been amended just twice. So once to reflect a study undertaken of future development in the vicinity of 41 and 176, and the second time to reflect some downtown, 3 in total. One for the central business district, the phase 1 and phase 2 studies. The second time for that study of 41, 176. And the third time, which was 1999-2000. And the third time in 2016 to reflect downtown planning principles, an updated land use map and parking map this was the conclusion of discussions around the redevelopment of Block 3, the current PNC Bank building. So on average, this happens a little more frequently than once a decade. But in looking at the results of your study of planned residential development regulations, a few things stood out to us that we think as staff merit a further amendment to the comprehensive plan. One, there's just a lot of material in the comprehensive plan that is no longer current because it's been realized, which is good. We like this about plans. They propose developments. They've generally happened. It's not a bad thing, and it doesn't hurt to update the plan to recognize that. The second is that there are times where the plan refers specifically to using a PRD to redevelop a property. And the meaning of that now is changing. That process is changing. And so we want to recognize that that's, if you read it without that context, you may come to different conclusions than were intended or that really are in line with the village's goals. A primary example, for one, is in one section of the code, of the plan, it speaks to wanting to facilitate transitions between different densities. And in different sections, it says, keep zoning as it is. Well, now in this new PRD tool, we're anticipating that people will rezone and have that deliberative process for density. And so those statements were not written in conflict with each other, but now they are, if you just read it coming new to it. The third is just in recently repealing, the Stonebridge preliminary plan and final plan. That's a lot of planning work that was done by the village to consider those developments that is of no legal effect right now. We all know it happened, but in a sense it didn't, right? And so we're trying to take some of the principles that were captured in those plans and document them as the village's land use policy. For example, preserving the front 10 acres, connecting to the adjacent trails, and so on. And then finally, probably the most critical part is this insertion of a new policy that deals with redevelopment of the estates. And that tries to sum up this density approach that's in the new PRD tool, which is there are public benefits that may merit additional residential density, such as historic preservation, such as alternative housing, and so on. And under those circumstances, the village may consider amending its zoning, or it may not. Again, we're trying to just capture the essence of this conversation and put it into what is the definitive policy document of the village when it comes to land use decisions. So you don't need to recommend this tonight if you don't want to. We're hoping, again, that this is a simple expression of what's been discussed in your workshops, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Cole. All right, any questions for Mr. Cole?
Most of the changes, as you said, have already taken place. In fact, everything you said here has already been done except for Stonebridge, which has to be changed. It's pretty matter of fact in my mind. I don't know why we would continue with this discussion. It's black and white, so to speak. And I'm okay with AD 210 for redevelopment.
Thank you, Member Miller.
Can I just
Ms.
ask,
Fisher.
so then will you, for annexation and development, for instance, does this get updated in the conversation? It kind of stopped at Belforet subdivision. Does mention of the sanctuary and Lansdowne and those kind of things get added to it, or is there no reason to change this language?
Sure. So I guess what we've tried to do here, high level, it is the time is ripe. It has been ripe for the village to write a new comprehensive plan. Mm-hmm. This isn't so old as to be problematic, but we know that writing the plan takes time. The village has tried and made a lot of progress on that before. Mm-hmm. In general, it should get done. You could spend a lot of time updating out-of-date materials throughout this plan and making it more current. Mm-hmm. A lot of the front matter, which doesn't have policy impacts, like I believe the pages you're referring to, could benefit from some updating, certainly. What we're trying to do is really focus on the most operative provisions of the plan, which are those goals, policies, and objectives. Those are the statements of what the village should do. And that's what we're trying to make sure is current, because if a plan comes forward of any type, you know, much of the work you see in front of you is more zoning based. It doesn't really affect the comprehensive plan, but take, for example, the Arden Shore redevelopment. We're going to take those policies right out and say, well, the plan says you should do A, B, C, D, and this is what you should use to guide your decision-making.
Right.
So we're trying to get those parts right.
Okay.
So would now be the time then if, because I couldn't find anything about the industrial park, like if the comprehensive plan or study usage and potential residential growth, or, you know, changing the footprint or format of the industrial park. Would that be something to be discussed now, or you know, just to think deeply about that area?
Yeah, I would again say the right forum for that is probably to update the comprehensive plan in its totality, right? I mean, that would be a substantial change in the village's land use trajectory. It may very well be a warranted one. Certainly, that's one that would take a lot of study to really wrap yourself around.
Right.
I should mention too, you know, I think I've reported this before, but the village has set aside a pretty substantial sum of money, $100,000, to retain a professional planning consultant to get this process started this year. Historically, in the village, you know, these prior efforts have been great. They've been headed up by village staff. At best, there is, you know, one of us dedicated to this job, and it's more than a one-person job, sad to say. But I think those are very important things to consider. I think they probably belong on a longer process.
So it's my understanding that we're just updating to reflect what current and recent past practice have shown to be best practice. And moving forward with the changes that we've made to the PRD to reflect the comprehensive plan. And the other things, as important as they are, we do need to address at some point. But these are just to reflect what we're actually doing. Am I correct in that?
Yeah, these updates are intended to really tie to the results of the study that yielded this new planned residential development tool, which was, we looked at the whole plan list. We know that a bunch of these no longer apply. We know that we really need to make 2 substantive updates based on the events of just the past year, and we're trying to just make those most timely updates.
Right. So we have to carry this forward, we have a series of documents that we follow between the PRD and other planning, yeah, like everything. And right now, in terms of the comprehensive plans, we really need to bring it up to date to show that we've been bringing zoning up to date, we've been doing these other pieces, and now it's just tying together what we've passed in the last couple of meetings effectively, or what we've recommended to the board. Is that correct? Did I?
I would say so, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. We're just stitching this up a little bit.
Yeah, it's
Cleaning
a
it up.
symbiotic, really, right? And we use
Exactly.
the comprehensive plan to guide our study to update this new PRD tool. We have insights from updating the PRD tool that we're using
Right.
to update the plan.
Right.
It's a virtuous cycle.
It seems to be pretty obvious as we've heard.
So is that what you're saying, Glenn, then after this would be approved, because I think we're all in favor of updating anything, it seems to be rather necessary, but after that, then the comprehensive plan would be, you're saying, hired or brought in somebody to really look at the next stages of what that really means?
So in the short term, let's assume you recommend this amendment. Let's assume the village board adopts it. You know, until then, there's a new plan done, we can do a lot of planning, but this is the official policy document, right? So a development comes in tomorrow, and this is the yardstick we have to use to measure it. So short-term, that sets the rules of engagement for today. The village has the budget to rewrite this whole document. And that includes, that can explore a lot of important things, right? We've talked about, multifamily housing opportunities. We've talked about the future of retail development in the industrial corridor. We're about to have one of the largest public works projects in the state of Illinois happen at 41-176 in the current, Restore Illinois budget plan. There's important things that need that close study and probably some new directions laid out and how the village legislates around them.
Great.
Any further discussion among the commissioners? Again, on this particular issue, we're a recommending body, so is there a motion?
I'll make a motion to accept the plan as
To recommend.
village board intent, amend the comprehensive plan as shown in the ordinance.
Thank you, Member Miller. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. Any further discussion? Okay. Hearing none, could we have a vote, please?
Certainly, Member Miller,
Aye.
Member Danley,
Aye.
Member Fisher,
Aye.
Member Sorensen,
Aye.
Member Toll,
Aye.
Chair Peters.
Aye.
Motion carries.
Thank you. Agenda item number 10, staff report. And thank you again, Mr. Blue, for the excellent work during the pendency of this project. Tremendous progress has been made.
Sure. So a brief staff report this evening. First, NSWRD, the pumping station down at Sunrise Park and Beach, was recommended by this body. It was recommended with a number of conditions by this body, by the Architectural Board of Review, and then it passed first reading at the village board. We anticipate the board will consider that for second reading, the final approval step on Monday night. There's a list out there of all the conditions that have been added over time. There's some final updated plans that we anticipate from Tesca, Tesca Associates, which is also representing NSWRD in that matter, any day now, really. So stay tuned for the final approval of that project. Again, so far, very well received. Our next meeting in October, goodness, last day of summer, here we are, all of us friends in the Lake Bluff Plan Commission. Our next meeting in October would probably have, between 3 and 5 items on the agenda. It'll probably be a meeting about as long as this. Some residential variations. I know, as I was thinking about it, Mr. Chairman, there have been some discussions about improvements at the, Lake Bluff Middle School that may come ripe at that time or may wait. And there will be one more item to discuss that I'll bring up here as my next report. So I think you'll recall for a few years now, really years, it was a process that started right before the COVID-19 pandemic and then was held up for a very long time. We have been trying to, my comments about our planned residential development tool about being 40, 50 years old, that's true for much of our zoning code, right? And we are trying to we know there won't be the horsepower to redo the whole thing anytime soon, but we're trying to untangle it. We're trying to make something that a typical human can pick up and read without a legal education or without a zoning education and understand how this stuff works. I'm proud to report to you that as of about 20 minutes before this meeting, that process is done. We have a draft for you. I need to write a memo to put in front of it, and we'll be trying to get that out to you, special delivery in a binder form here in the next few days, probably Friday or Monday.
I can't wait.
Yeah, it's thrilling. It's really exciting stuff. All I'll say is there's a few substantive parts that you should read and think about, and I think will inspire your thinking.
Will you give us those?
They'll be in highlight. They'll be in highlight. And then you can pretend to read the other 40 pages, save them for a long plane ride.
40.
Well, I'm saying, at least 40 will be interesting, and the other 40 will, But it's really untangling a lot of stuff that's already there. It's a lot. It's been a lot of work. Again, trying to make this so that when we, when we have village staff looking at this, when we have developers looking at this, when we have our esteemed consultants looking at this, that it's a readable, modern code. So I apologize in advance for giving you a fairly dry document. I'll say that it's one of these things that we can take as little or as much time as we need to work through it. There are substantive items that I think we'll have an interesting conversation about, but you can look for a first discussion of that item in October. That would conclude my report.
Thank you, Mr. Gold. Don't disappoint us.
I think the bar is set very low for how interesting this document will be, so I hope to exceed expectations.
All right, we appreciate that. Agenda item number 11, Commissioners Report.
It was interesting in the newspaper today. I do read the paper. Naperville is doing a PRD on a polo field. Big development with Pulte, like 240 units and so forth. It's going to include affordable housing, what they consider affordable housing for, did you see that in the paper?
$125,000 income,
Yeah, and the home would cost about $440, I read.
Wow.
So it's interesting that, other community, they have the space to do it, obviously, and the population is large enough, but I thought it was very interesting in terms of what we've been talking about.
No, thank you, Member Miller. Any other questions or comments for Mr. Cole or for the commission generally? Hearing none, is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
That's why I thought this would be next.
Well, thank you very much. We got through this much more quickly than I anticipated.
Words.
It keeps us legal, I know, when we use that crib sheet.